Okay, awesome. So thank you for having me. Thank you again, Theo, and organizers for putting me a little bit later in the schedule. The sun is up here, the birds are chirping, but my pets and family aren't awake yet, so it's not going to be too difficult to focus. Yeah, thank you for having me. Thanks also for those of you who reached out to me ahead of time to share some specific questions you had on this topic. It's always nice to know what people are curious about and worrying about or thinking about. And I'm excited to share some of what I've learned in my work, and hopefully to leave you with some practical advice on how to engage with the clinical experts that you work with every day. So a little bit about who I am. I've been working in the UX field for over 20 years now in a whole bunch of roles in different companies. And the second half of that has been pretty heavily focused in the healthcare space. This has included some EMRs from scratch, complete overhauls, minor updates to old legacy systems, things like patient portals and other patient-facing apps. And for the last 2.5 years, I've been leading the UX team at Varian Medical Systems. Varian's a company I hope you'll never have to be familiar with, but we're a global company that delivers oncology hardware and software. We've been around since the 40s making radiotherapy machines, and we've since evolved to include a huge range of hardware and software to deliver all modes of oncology care. So this is our corporate vision, and whenever I walk into some sort of a meeting room with this projected, or a poster in the washroom at the office or whatever, even a coffee mug, I still kind of pause in my tracks. And I can't remember ever in my career working for a company where the vision kind of really gets me at my core quite like this one. I'm sure we've all been affected by cancer in some way, probably closer than we wish we were. But it's the kind of sort of vision I can just really get behind this long term. And so a lot of what I'm going to be sharing today is going to include recent examples and situations from this role at Varian. And this is a global company with a 30+ UX team across the world, dozens of products and customers worldwide. But I've also been sort of the one lonely UX consultant brought on to a healthcare startup of 5 people that are just trying to get their beta product into the hands of their first clinical customer. And all the same truths apply. What I'm going to share today just kind of scales with your org size. So getting into today's topic, I'm going to assume that all of you at some point in your respective projects have talked to a doctor or a nurse or another healthcare provider who is an end user of your product. So now you're all set, right? Of course you're not. Constant access to clinical experts at all stages of our product design and development is essential to our work effectively, for us to work effectively in the healthcare field. And it's not like a single checkbox on your to-do list, obviously. And while I don't know any of you personally, I know that you know that, so I'm not here to convince you that you need to talk to your users. We all know that that's just good UX practice. What I did want to take a moment to acknowledge, though, is that the need to integrate regular and constant and frequent input from users and subject matter experts is even more important in the healthcare field than I've observed it to be in other domains. The frequency with which we need to get this advice and input from these experts exceeds what might be adequate in these other domains. And I think if we ask ourselves why, I think it ultimately comes down to the fact that clinical needs are often more divergent from what general design best practices or industry standards might suggest. The reality of working in clinics, caring for patients at the most vulnerable moments of their lives, making these life and death decisions, this reality just doesn't always apply sort of and follow the same principles that might happily work for e-commerce or movie streaming or something like that. And if we look at some of these, principles that we love, they're pretty hard to argue with, right? And I've argued these with our clinical users, only to learn that there's another more important principle, likely linked to safety or privacy or some other domain-specific need that kind of trumps our little UX principles that apply elsewhere. So things like less is more, I don't know, not always. You can't exactly strip down a patient list to just a first name, last name, because then you're at huge risk of treating the wrong patient the wrong way, right? This whole notion of don't make me think, this terrifies me in healthcare, right? I mean, one of the things that we're constantly coming up with in my work, it's even something as simple as not allowing a dialogue to have a primary action button, because it might influence a decision, right? You want them to truly consider both options and decide which one to proceed with. Don't make me do the same thing 3 times. Well, nurses have to check the patient's ID 3 times, 4 times, 5 times at various points before they're going to administer chemotherapy, right? This whole idea of making things easy to scam and easy to skim, this is totally not applicable, or at least not in the same fashion. Just last week, we dove into some really detailed standards around how to display lists of medications. And Australia's guidelines are excellent. If you haven't reviewed them, and if you work with medication lists, please dig into those. And they specifically advise design choices, including somewhat weird typography and spacing and sort of physical hyphens and things that are supposed to slow you down. You know, it's not supposed to be skimmed. They kind of want you to read it like a telegram where every single character registers, so nothing's accidentally skimmed over. And so, you know, I could do a whole talk on healthcare principles that directly oppose our favorite UX principles, but that's not what I proposed today. What I did propose was a look at some of the different types of clinical experts that you might have at your disposal, or that you might wish to get access to, and how you should best engage their expertise throughout your process. So what I'm going to do is describe 5 different types of clinical experts. And this isn't roles like, you know, doctors, nurses, pharmacists. This is about their relationship to you, your product, and your company. And so I'm just going to list them here, and then we're going to go into each one in detail and sort of talk about what you can and can't expect them to contribute to your process. So the first set we have is our in-house clinical experts. Then we've got people that are on clinical advisory boards and that sort of thing. We've got sort of these reference sites or first customers or early adopters of our products. We've got the ad hoc recruited participants that you bring in for specific research activities. And then we've got the randomly encountered clinicians, as I've called them. So these are the groups we're going to be looking at. And depending on your role or your team makeup or your company size or your product maturity, you might have one of these, you might have all of these, and that's totally okay, as long as you're using them to gather the kind of feedback that they are well equipped to support and to offer. So I'm going to go through these one by one. So the first one, our in-house clinical experts. At Varian, we have lots of these. Many of our product managers are former clinicians. We've got a few on our UX team. I'm really disappointed that I missed Dr. Melissa's session this morning. It was a bit early for my standards, but I would have loved to know, you know, what it's like to be the clinical expert, the in-house clinical expert on the team. But this photo here is actually one of these cases where we've got a design sprint, and about 1/3 of the people there are internal Varian staff who happen to have a clinical background. And so when you look at sort of who these people are, these are some really important things about how they relate to you and your work. So you're both on the same payroll. They probably don't practice clinically anymore. Their role is defined by their relationship to the product you're working on and not by their relationship to patients or other care team members. And ultimately, they have a product to ship. That's their responsibility. And so what we're going to do is sort of look at what you can count on these people for. So they're amazing at just being there to provide quick answers to day-to-day questions. They're right there beside you, a phone call away. You usually know what time zone they are in. You can call them, they'll answer. They're great at providing real examples and scenarios. So you kind of have these, you know, requirements that are in some sort of a list somewhere. And then you're like, well, what does this actually mean? How might somebody end up needing this specific thing? They're great at filling that sort of stuff in. They're great at running pilot tests with. So if you're going to go do some sort of a fairly robust research activity, with user groups that are pretty hard to access, it's great to run them through your internal experts first to sort of work out any kinks and make sure it's all working and making sense. They're great at raising safety concerns. So they'll kind of look at what you're developing and designing together, and they'll tell you, well, okay, here's where we're going to come up against a patient safety issue or this sort of a safety issue and so on. And they're really good at just leveling up the whole team's clinical expertise. So having them there day in and day out, they kind of just, get embedded into everyone's consciousness, and you all end up coming away, being able to sound moderately competent when you talk about the scenarios that you're designing for. And they can do some usability testing sessions. So I'm going to start with a giant disclaimer here, and it'll apply to all the experts I'm going to talk about today. And depending on where you sell your products, whether they're classified as medical devices or not, there are strict guidelines regarding who you can and cannot qualify for various types of validation activities. So follow these guidelines that apply to your region and your product type when you're selecting your test participants. In general, what seems to be one of the common themes is that formative testing can be done with a wide range of people, including these in-house experts, as long as they're not working directly on it. So, maybe my clinical expert on my team can, test your product and yours can test mine and that kind of a thing. But we typically can't use them for things like summative tests, and there's a lot more restrictions for who is an appropriate candidate for that. But really, it's the relationship to that specific product that tends to be what allows you to use them or not. So with that disclaimer, I'm going to say that in-house experts can be used for formative tests as long as they're not directly involved with the product that they're testing. And then what you can't necessarily use them for that much, they tend to not be the best at just sort of judging between different interaction details. In many cases, when they do have a different role, such as product manager or some other sort of a role, they kind of know the cost of one interaction decision over another. So maybe you have this super elegant solution that would be great for the users, and your product manager is like, right, but that's going to take 3 times as long. And suddenly they've got this bias towards shipping something fast or whatever. And they're also just quite close to the product to give that kind of feedback. They're often not necessarily great at current day clinical realities. Many of our clinical experts have been out of the clinic for 5 years or more, and stuff changes fast. So while their sort of clinical scenarios might be appropriate in terms of what sorts of patients might show up with different sets of problems and so on, they probably can't necessarily speak for clinicians today in terms of what is happening in clinics. They're not necessarily great at being able to make sort of value judgments between what features you may or may not want to invest time in. Again, they're trying to ship a product in many cases. So being able to determine what will truly help a clinic needs to come from the people who are in the clinic and dealing with that right now. And this last one, I think it depends on the person, but sort of out of the box thinking, in many cases, sort of opposes their desire to just ship a product, right? I've had some super creative and super innovative thinking clinical experts on some teams, but in general, I've found that that gets sort of reduced the longer they've been with an organization, which is too bad. And so if we kind of bring this all together and sort of summarize them, I'm going to start assembling this chart that doesn't necessarily include all the different ways you can engage with them, but it'll just show some patterns in terms of how we can or can't use these various experts. So in this case, these in-house experts, they're great at sort of those realistic scenarios, quick feedback, safety issues, some formative testing. Their ability to judge what's valuable to a clinic or not may not be as good. Co-design, ideation, maybe not, and same with summative testing. And I've got this example from a quote from Donna. She's one of the product managers that I work with. She's a former chemotherapy infusion nurse. And we're in the middle of just figuring out why some certain thing needs to be part of a specific feature. And she just threw this example at us, and suddenly it all made sense. So she's telling us how there's a scenario where a patient's getting a syringe of some medicine, and normally it's no problem. You can have this single time being the sort of the administration time. But in this case, because of fragile veins, it's going to have to be slower over 5 or 10 minutes. So you're going to have to be able to accommodate this variability. And she just always throws in these real examples for why we have to accommodate a certain scenario. And it's just super helpful to the whole team. And then finally, how to become BFFs with your in-house experts. I think the biggest thing we want to think about here is avoiding an us versus them mentality. We as UX professionals have always thought it's our job to represent the users. And the clinical experts on our teams have often been brought on to represent the users. And it doesn't take much to start butting heads over, who's going to do that. And as soon as you can get to a place where you realize you're both going to do that really well, the better off your products are going to be. Another one is to find a way to channel their unsolicited advice. This sounds a little bit mean and condescending. I don't mean it that way. But again, they have so many stories and examples that might not seem relevant to a specific conversation at a specific time, but being able to hang on to those things that they share and sort of store them somewhere in your mind or something a bit more formal so that you can pull them up when necessary and just sort of hear their voice to sort of inform your work, the better off your products will be. Okay, so that's our first expert. We're going to go through this for the rest of them, and hopefully it's going to start coming together. So the next bunch is these clinical advisory board members. I've been fortunate so we have one of these, well, a couple of these at Varian, and I've been fortunate to work with them in some previous consulting arrangements as well. But these are basically people who are currently practicing medicine, and they're somehow compensated by your company in order to give their input at some kind of a regular cadence. So whether you have, monthly meetings, quarterly in person, some things or whatever, there's some sort of an arrangement where they've agreed to be these advisors. They're pretty motivated to contribute to the long-term success of the systems they use. That's usually why they've joined this advisory board. And their role is defined by the relationship to patients and clinics. You're just kind of a side project for them. And I think that's pretty important in terms of how they can work with you. So some of the things we can do with these advisory board members, well, they're great at providing strategic direction because they've sort of been embedded in your work deeply enough and long enough to know that you've got business constraints and roadmaps and that kind of stuff, but their feet are primarily planted in the clinic and they can tell you what will keep them happy customers over the long run and how to prioritize certain things. They're great at sort of driving for change. That's probably why they joined the advisory board. They have ideas and they want to see those come to fruition. They're pretty good at giving feedback on concepts and kind of following along through iterations. So instead of just showing them something once and getting a reaction, you can take their input, iterate, bring it back to them, get input, iterate, and so on. And so you really are sort of co-creating at that point. And they are quite good at brainstorming and ideating because they've sort of ramped up with you over time. They can sort of pick up and start contributing in that sort of collaborative way quite quickly. They can sometimes help with safety concerns depending on how applicable to that specific region is to their own role. They're also great at being able to offer sort of a competitive comparison. They typically use lots of products in their clinics, and they can tell you, well, your medication list's fine, but you should see what so-and-so does. And they can sort of say what they've seen elsewhere, and you can sort of, learn from their experience. Also great at providing contacts within their organization. So, regardless of what role they have, they know tons of people in their organization that can answer specific questions to those roles. So you want to make friends with them too. And again, like I mentioned before, they can do some usability testing for some formative tests if it's not something that they personally had designed. In terms of what they can't do so well, they can't represent all roles. So if you've got a pharmacist in your advisory board, that person can speak for pharmacists. So you're going to have your advisory board be made up of all the roles that you want represented, because they just can't speak for somebody else. The other thing I noticed, the advisory boards tend to attract more senior people within clinics, and they're not necessarily great at empathizing with some of their lower ranking staff. It's like they've forgotten where they came from in some cases. And so if we need input from some of, a front desk admin or something like that, we'll need to speak to them directly. They're also not going to be available 24/7. They've got patients to treat, clinics to run. You can't just call them up anytime and get an answer from them. And they're also, I've noticed, not necessarily great at balancing the cost of what they're asking for against the engineering effort behind it. So they're sort of close enough to understand your overall process and strategy and direction, but not necessarily to be able to say, having this autocomplete means it's going to be 3 months later or whatever. So as that sort of gets mapped onto this sort of a grid, we can see that the advisory board members can do a lot, but the challenge with them is we can't have them all the time, right? You can't expect them to be available all the time. We can't expect our companies to compensate them for that kind of frequent involvement. And I've got one great quote from an advisory board member who was listening to us, talking through some sort of a solution patiently. He's just following along and trying to make sense of it. And he kind of looks at us all and he says, I totally agree with how you guys are going to execute this, but what's the value? And he kind of just brought us back to this question, which really is at the core of what we should be doing. He's like, yeah, that all sounds possible. Your databases are great, but where are we actually going with this? And so having them listen in and be able to ask this kind of stuff is really where the value is. In terms of how to work with them, they kind of, I've noticed there's a trend of sort of spoiling them. Their sort of yearly meetings can be in fancy venues. There's going to be wining and dining and that kind of thing. So these people aren't cheap to have on board. Like having an advisory board costs the company a fair bit of money. And so as a result, you really want to use their time well, right? So you want to listen more and talk less. You don't want to be trying to convince them of anything. You want them to really be sharing what they know. And you don't want to be trying to sell to them. There are other people in your organization who probably do have that sales role. So let them do the selling. You're going to do the listening and learning, and you're going to sort of become partners. Okay, so the next one I'm going to share, this idea of reference sites or your first customers or early adopters. And so this is actually a picture of one of our reference sites for one of the products we were working on. That's me on the right with one of my colleagues. And they basically just invited us in to do a couple days of observations. This is one of the nurses' stations. And so these people may or may not be current customers. They currently are practicing medicine. You'll likely get a team of them, not just a single contact. They typically have some sort of a serious problem or gap or something that they're trying to get fixed or solved. And that's why they've entered some sort of contractual arrangement with you with some sort of indirect compensation for their feedback. So either they get, a discount on the product, maybe it's going to be free. Somehow they're being compensated for collaborating with you to build this together. And they're typically laser focused on what they specifically need. So what you can count on these people for is they're good at judging what makes sense and what's good enough. They can kind of tell you, yeah, we'll take it. That's cool. That's all we need. Access to clinics, like I just showed in that picture. They will often welcome you in with open arms, not during global pandemics, but otherwise they typically do happily bring you in so you can learn and observe and see exactly how things work so that you can solve for their problems. They'll share those real life current examples and constraints from clinical situations to technical integrations to anything else that is going to help them succeed with this product. They'll definitely raise safety concerns. Much like the advisory board members, they'll work with you through concept reviews, through iterations. They're pretty good at brainstorming and ideating because they're so focused on solving what it is they have. So if you structure this sort of a co-design activity with them, they really will be good contributors. These people typically do appreciate the cost of what they're asking for because as you start talking about scope and you start telling them, this means it's going to be an extra 6 months before we ship it, or that means we have to take off this other feature to meet this deadline, they start to sort of barter and trade with you on these kinds of things. And again, some usability testing depending on their relationship to the product itself. What they're not necessarily so good at is representing other institutions. Sure, they might work in other clinics and other hospitals. But for the most part, they're laser focused on what they need for their clinic. They typically don't necessarily zoom out to see the long-term product roadmap or strategy. If your company has multiple products and multiple sort of areas where they work, they're going to kind of have blinders on and really focus on their solution, their space, their specific problems. And they're not very neutral in their opinions. They're quite focused on what they specifically need. So as you sort of see what these reference sites can offer, again, much like the advisory boards, there are many things they can do for us, but also from an availability perspective, they typically are very available, much more than advisory boards, but we typically engage with them sort of at the beginning of a project. So when you're about to launch that first version, get the beta out, you typically won't have a reference site for sort of incremental releases and updates of a product. So they're less likely to engage in that kind of a relationship. This came up just in the sprint demo a couple of weeks ago. So a lot of the reference sites that we work with for some of our new products will just be completely immersed in a lot of our in-sprint activities. So they'll be there on our design reviews, they'll be there at the sprint demos, and they just throw out completely honest feedback like this. You know, I think this was a some sort of a very varian self-serving thing that we put into the product, something with like release notes or something that nobody's going to really look at. And they were just like, yeah, that's just a lot of space. Let's make that, let's hide that one behind a click. So how to work with these people, I think it's super important to understand their constraints and listen to them. And also being very transparent about what you are or are not going to incorporate into the product. So they're going to give you all kinds of requests, all kinds of features and functionality that they want. And it's really on you to sort of make them feel heard. And if something's not going into V1, let them know if that's because it's just never going to happen, if it's going to get deferred, if there's some sort of conflict between 2 or 3 things that they're asking for or whatever it might be. You sort of owe it to them to explain some of these decisions that you're making and provide that rationale. So we've got 2 more to go through. So these ad hoc research participants that you recruit for a specific research activity, these are people who may or may not be current customers. They currently are practicing medicine. They probably have very limited knowledge of your project or the product development process. They're probably swooping in sort of for this one-time engagement. Maybe you'll return to them for follow-ups, but there's really no long-term commitment that you have with them typically. They're compensated for a fixed period of time, again, depending on your region. There are different rules that apply, but they're basically these people that you have recruited to solve a specific need for participants with a specific role. And so, of course, you can count on them for usability testing, formative testing, summative testing, whatever it is you happen to need. This is kind of the people that you pull in. You can pull them in for some co-designing activities, but there's a lot of framing and structuring required so that they can contribute in the way that you need them to contribute. They're great at raising safety concerns, providing real-life examples. They'll also kind of accidentally often give you these competitive comparisons. They'll be like, oh, this isn't quite like we have in this product over here. They've got these awesome random nuggets of brilliance and these honest reactions to things that the people we have longer term relationships with might try to sort of sugarcoat their words a little bit. These people often don't do that, which I find lovely. What you can't necessarily do with these people, you can't just have a question on a Monday afternoon, call them up and ask. Like the recruiting process is slow and long. So you're going to have to plan to get these questions answered. You'll often have a queue of things that you sort of line up for the next round of testing that you're going to schedule and recruit for. It's hard for them to grasp sort of the big picture and context of your project easily. They don't really know about you and your job and what you're trying to do. So there's a lot of framing that you have to do in order for them to give useful feedback. We can't count on them to understand hand waving. So if you have these like half-baked ideas and you want to get their general reaction to it, they're going to ask you to finish baking the idea so that they can give you useful feedback, because they don't know what part they're supposed to be commenting on. And so I find that for these people, the sorts of stimulus materials that you need to provide for them to respond to needs to be clinically accurate, needs to be quite complete, or it needs to be clear which parts are not complete, and ask them specifically to ignore that and hope that they can do it. Just last week, I was doing we were doing some summative test, no, it was formative testing on chemotherapy regimen planning. And I guess I had some pre-med put in the sequence after the main chemotherapy medication, and every single person was just pointing out that that didn't make sense. So I had to just go ahead and fix the prototype before we could continue, because they were all getting hung up on it, and that was totally my fault. So this is where those in-house experts are awesome at being able to catch these issues before you bring it to these carefully recruited external people. So as you start to see what these people can do, again, there's lots of stuff that they can do, lots of things they can answer. Much of it's not very quick. And from that really sort of big picture scoping, it's going to be hard to get them ramped up on what your overall strategy is and so on. I had this one excellent comment from a session when we were doing this chemotherapy regimen research. And one of our oncologists who builds these plans, he said, you know, this isn't 100% user-friendly, but chemotherapy administration isn't that friendly. So you really have to consider each detail. And this wasn't a criticism. He was kind of commenting on that part, that being forced to sort of pause and really consider and be consciously making decisions each step along the way was something he appreciated in the product. He didn't want to save clicks at this point. He wanted to carefully consider each step. In terms of the sort of honest feedback you get from them, I heard this one a couple months ago. This was one of the clinic administrators, and she just said, you know, I love my physicians, but this is where I go to my trunk, grab a bat, and I take it to their kneecaps. And what she was trying to tell us was that this product needed to help her either get clinicians to complete this one task, or allow them to delegate it, or not block other workflows if that task wasn't complete. And so it was one of these things where she could very clearly speak about her experience, which was trying to deal with this lack of compliance from a lot of the physicians that she was working with. So how to work well with these folks? I think the big thing is to just assure them that they're the expert. They really don't know what they're supposed to do when they join you for this hour or whatever. So sort of assure them that they're the expert. Make sure that, this, old line, make sure they know that they're not being tested, but the product is. And it's really on you to structure your questions such that they feel comfortable answering. Even if they go off topic, they're likely going to give you some useful input anyway, and sort of just give them time, don't rush them, listen to them. So my last type of expert is Uncle Peter the pharmacist. That's my uncle, actually, at a Christmas, no, this was a pizza bake-off we did. My dad's an oncologist, the poor nurse who sat beside me on the plane. These are all of the sort of randomly encountered clinicians that unfortunately get to be interrogated by you. So these are people who are probably not current customers. They currently are practicing medicine. They have zero obligation to help you or your product. They just want to get back to their dinner, coffee, or movie. One of the women on my team, she has a roommate who is a chemotherapy infusion nurse, and my God, I feel terrible for that roommate, especially now in the middle of this lockdown. She's being interrogated constantly. But so a couple of things that I don't know about you, but we as UX people are typically quite curious, and we will ask and ask and ask whenever there is somebody who might have some insight that we can gain. So these randomly encountered clinicians, they're great for stories. They'll give us a glimpse into their realities, their challenges, their obstacles that might not be necessarily on our radar. They're great at describing what they're doing. So this, certainly when you're in any kind of a clinical encounter with yourself or a loved one, like just a couple months ago, I took my dad to his first chemotherapy session, and the nurse is walking with this little Post-it note from him in his chair, to this computer in the corner. So of course I asked her what she's doing. And she explained this whole thing about how the administration details are captured on that computer and she can't do it on this computer and she can never remember the numbers. And so she just describes what she's doing in the moment. And it didn't really slow her down too much to explain this. So it's these things where you can just ask them, hey, what are you doing here? They're great at giving you an outside perspective on your assumptions or ideas because they're kind of, you know, not in your world, not in your bubble. They'll just sort of tell you what their experiences are. And they'll give you honest answers because they've got nothing to hide, nothing to protect. They're not trying to maintain some kind of a relationship with you, especially if it's your Uncle Peter, the pharmacist. What you can't necessarily do, or you can't do at all, you can't count on them for any kind of dedicated time or attention. Other experts have committed to give you that. These people have not. You can ask them to kind of grasp your job, your role, your goals, your big picture. Like, don't give them your background or story. Just sort of see what you can learn and observe with minimal interruption to their life. And a lot of this, what we get from them, I don't so much have a quote as just this picture of what I saw at the clinic a couple months ago. I took my dad to chemo, and there's no patient details here, so it's fine. But this is actually where it's basically mixed chemo medications that for whatever reason weren't administered, they don't want to waste. And so they kind of have all of these things stuck saying, you've got like, you know, a day to use this. If somebody else comes in, don't get the pharmacist to mix it, grab this and use it, because these things, once mixed, have a pretty short shelf life, but they're super expensive. And so they have all these ways of trying to kind of track this stuff, right? And this is stuff that would never have been on my radar, but suddenly, I don't know if this is going to end up on our product feature list. I don't know, but it's a reality that I suddenly learned about. So how to become BFFs with these randomly encountered clinicians? I think the biggest thing is to read their cues. If they're interested in talking to you, cool. If they completely aren't, just, you need to back off because they owe you nothing. And I find a really good way to engage with them is just to kind of find out what they're passionate about and let them lead. You know, especially when you're sort of sitting next to that nurse on the plane and suddenly she tells you about a specific safety initiative that she's taken at her clinic, then she's going to tell you everything about that, and you'll certainly learn from it. So these randomly encountered people are probably the least reliable for many of these specific areas, but they certainly provide sort of these realistic scenarios and some unexpected insights. So those are all the people that I was going to talk about, and you don't need all of these. If you're sitting back and thinking, wow, there's no way I can get all these people available to me, that's totally fine. You don't need them all. What you do need is to know the people that you're working with, who are they? And based on their relationship to you and your product, what can they do for you? What can they be asked to contribute? What can they do without bias, and so on? And we need these people. We need to find them, we need to befriend them, and we need to find ways to make them willing to work with us in the long run. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to truly respect these experts' time and experience. Besides the ones that have in-house roles with you and your company, they have patients to treat, they have clinics to run. That's where their focus really should be. And so if you are going to find time to schedule, to get their input, come organized, come prepared, make sure you're not asking them to repeat themselves, make sure you've asked them structured questions so they can give you the kind of feedback that you need so you can all get back to your, whatever else you're doing as quickly as possible. And I think what we have to constantly remember is that in healthcare especially, I just think we can't trust our design instincts to get stuff right all the time. We need to become partners with these people because neither their clinical experience nor our UX principles alone are going to result in a great product. If you've ever seen these sort of physician-designed interfaces to solve some specific problem, they're good, but we all have ideas of how we can make it better. And so it really is this partnership that's going to result in great products. So that's all I have for you today. So thank you all for your attention. Yes, there we go. I found it. Okay.
Okay.
How do you reconcile different opinions from your various clinical expert groups, or even within a clinical expert group? Well, one of my favorite ways is to have them fight it out, actually. So this works well with things like clinical advisory boards, internal experts, and the reference customers. If you let them discuss amongst themselves, either they will come to a conclusion, but that's rare, or you'll start to see what is behind a lot of those preferences and opinions. And ultimately, if there are two truly diverging opinions or perspectives, sometimes all we have to do is find out, do we have to support both? Or is there one that wins? Because sometimes we do have to support both. Like sometimes they're not even opinions, right? And to be honest, we try not to design to support opinions, but we rather try and make sure we're focused on solving problems. So if we can agree on the problems, if there are multiple scenarios in which those might need to be solved, then we have to decide if both of those are in scope or not. But the first step is let them solve it and just listen. And secondly, sort of bringing it back to the problem we're trying to solve, and are we trying to support both, or is there some sort of a scoping that we as a company have to do for our own roadmap? Does that make sense? I'm going to assume there's a smile and a nod somewhere. The lack of sort of response is completely disorienting. So doing my best there. Okay, awesome. Yes, thank you.
Totally. Excellent.
So this next one, how many projects did it take to gather all this experience with these experts? And is this a co-design tool from you and your peers that you use in your everyday life? So I think before I started my current role at Varian, that was about 2.5 years ago, I spent about 8 or 9 years in a consulting role where most of my projects were healthcare based. And I think that the first time that I started to work with a clinical advisory board was when I realized that we really have to treat our clinical experts, our different clinical experts, differently. Because on one hand, it was just so amazing to have these people who were dedicated to help us at a regular cadence. We didn't have to go through these big recruiting efforts. But I started to see that there was a lot of bias introduced in what they were doing. And there were certain things that we simply couldn't ask them for once we had once they had seen too much, right? And so I had to, at that point, sort of stop and reconsider, okay, great, what can this person do for me? And what do I need to recruit other people to help with? And then once I joined Varian, I started to see this whole idea of these reference customers. I'd never had that previously in my previous roles. And so I just started to see these nuances in who can do what. And I feel super lucky at this point to be with a company big enough to have different products at different stages of development with different relationships to customers. So it's interesting to have observed this. What audiences are the hardest to build relationships with? So physicists, we work with a lot of these physicists that basically do a lot of the planning of radiation therapy. And there is something about these people. They are super smart. They don't like to talk very much. And I hate stereotyping people, but that's exactly what I'm doing. They're not very, they like to really sort of have a lot of heads down time to think. If you bring them into any kind of a collaborative environment, they tend to not contribute very much in the moment. They're good for sort of giving one-on-one input, but in general, I find they are quite resistant to change. They're happy to find ways to work with the tools they have. They're reluctant to participate in these kinds of engagements at all, but they're really at the core of the work that we do at Varian. Like, I mean, our first entire half century of work was making radiation therapy machines. So the physicists were one of our key users at that point. So I found them, because they don't spend much time face-to-face with users or other clinical people, they're just very sort of heads down focused on how they work. So they've been difficult ones to sorry, that was a specific role. I'm not sure if that was the question. In terms of audiences, do you mean which of these different 5 types? And if that's the case, then I think I had a lot of trouble building relationships with our internal experts initially. And I think it was that butting heads over who speaks for the user. I didn't realize I was stepping on their toes as much as I originally was. And I kept trying to tell them, you know, I have this design principle which says we should do this. And they were like, well, that's cool, but I've done this in a clinic where we have this reality. So I had to rebuild some relationships that I started poorly initially.